It is the morning after Leeds United's match against Stoke City, and rather than sit and mourn the end of Patrick Bamford's career, at least as a centre-forward that's allowed to have shots on target, I thought I'd have a look at what the deeper problems are at Leeds United, because they were clearly existing before Bamford came on last night, and I figured there's not many people diving into the more analytical side and are more looking at the individual error that seemed to have cost us the match. So I'm going to run through what the problem is, its sources, and potentially how we can fix it going forwards. And the issue isn't XG underperformance, even though we're slightly scoring fewer goals than we should. It's not the defensive issues that we're facing, because the goal last night was an own goal that we could do nothing about. And it's not necessarily losing control of the midfield either. And it might surprise some people, it's not necessarily Bamford. It's slow starts. And it's important to note that in football, patience isn't always a virtue. And going throughout the season, it's been very easy to see that in the first half of matches, we've been a little bit slower, a little bit off the ball, not quite at the pace of the match. And that's caused us some fairly big problems. I had a look through all of our matches this season, including the two in the League Cup, to see potential causes of that problem and how we can solve it. And the problem is pretty big. If we were looking at first half points this season, if the match ended at 45 minutes plus added time, we'd be in 17th place on 16 points. Not only that, but we'd have a goal difference of -6, and we'd have fallen behind in 9 out of 15 matches in the season so far. That is really, really telling, and it shows that in terms of getting up and running in any given match, we're just not there at the moment. It's especially notable that 2 of those matches include playing against lower league opponents. That is, to be quite honest, painful. And there's some matches where, because I've just taken the first half into account, the number of matches we've fallen behind is a little bit worse than you might expect, because against Ipswich we fell behind, but then we scored 3 goals in fairly quick succession. That one didn't even come into the first half points issue, because we switched on very, very quickly immediately following that. But it's very easy to see, looking at all of this data, that there is a big underlying issue with the way that we take on first halves and even into the second half. The fact I've devised it between first half, second half doesn't even show the whole picture, because there's some matches where we will scrape the first half with a half-time equaliser, or we'll be behind until the 75th minute or something daft like that. And yeah, it's not very good. I had a look at the first half versus the second half, so I've looked at second half points as well, and I'm going to have a quick look at the numbers. In the second half, at home, we have an average points per game of, I think, 2, maybe 2 and a little bit, something like that. Depends on if you want to take the cup matches into account. In away matches, that is 1.57, which means that there's very clearly something behind the crowd backing us. But it's even more worrying. It's not the crowd can push the team forwards in every single match, because they can't, because you'll get away matches. You'll have to go down to Plymouth, where the away following will be big, but it will not be big enough to push the team across the line with all of the support that it necessarily needs. So the big question is, where is the problem? I know that it's not starting very well, but how aren't we starting well? So I had a look at some of our highlights from these matches to sort of find what goes wrong. And the first thing I noticed was there's a sort of limited understanding of roles. This was especially true in last night's match, where Ilya Gruev and Archie Gray both looked a little bit off the pace. And I think that's because they don't quite understand their slot in the squad at the moment, or what their role is. Specifically for Gruev, because it was his first start, he'd had something like 7 minutes before yesterday night's game. And Archie Gray isn't necessarily a right back. He seems like more of a midfielder, so it's easy to see why sometimes he gets a little bit lost. He wants to play with the ball at his feet a little bit more, rather than doing that Luke Ayling-y thing of bombing down the line. Furthermore, you've got a slight problem of people getting up to speed with the game. That is both up to speed with the game and up to speed in themselves. In themselves, you're talking the likes of Jadon Anthony last night, for example. Didn't really play much football for Leeds before last night, and then in last night's match, he just seemed to, when he gets the ball, take a moment too long, take a moment of thinking, what are you meant to do with the ball at your feet, and how do I create a decent chance? The likes of Jorginho Rutter aren't having this issue, but that's because he's played so much football this season already. I feel like Anthony will need a few consistent starts to get up to pace, but there's also the issue of getting up to speed with the match itself. Stoke pressed a lot higher and harder than we expected, and I think Norwich did the same. And in both of those matches, our sides haven't gotten up to speed, haven't matched them and played them the way that they want us to. And when we're behind the pace of the match, it's much easier for them to play through us, to ultimately break us down, create chances, and leave us behind. Norwich in particular was a big issue there. Ipswich was the same, and I think there were a few times we were lucky to not go behind to Stoke. It's not getting up to speed with their tactics and not adapting to them quickly enough. Tactical adaptations. I feel like we expect us to have the ball all the time and to be able to play in their half and break them down that way through nice little clever footwork from Ruter or Anthony or Nonto. And then when that doesn't happen, we seem to be sort of spooked and scarpered. We've also got a slight issue of players returning from injuries. This is sort of a selection issue, sort of a wider problem. But for example, last night we couldn't play Crescencio Somerville from the start because he had a pre-season injury that he's still getting painkillers for. Having those players missing that are, as I'll explain a little bit later, sort of the solution to the issue is a big problem for us because we find ourselves leaning on these players quite often. Like if Ruter gets an injury, we could be in deep trouble, and that is not something that I really want to consider at the moment because he is our most creative player. But what's the solution? I think there's a few. There's a few things that we can consider. And the first up is faster tactical changes. I think Daniel Farke waited till something like the 70th minute in last night's match. I can have a very quick look, actually, to make his subs, and that was bringing on Patrick Bamford, Crescencio Somerville, and Dan James. Now, we've heard that Crescencio Somerville couldn't come on from the start. I'm going to bring up the match just to make sure I've got this right because I don't like being misleading or anything like that. It makes me feel icky. Yeah, 70th minute we made those changes. And they worked. They worked very quickly because we had more direct players on the pitch in the form of Somerville and James. And I think that's another solution, which is to start the more direct players. Dan James will just run at a defender. Crescencio Somerville will look to take someone on because he's sort of greedy with the ball in a good way. He's someone that trusts himself when he has the ball, thinks, I can probably get a goal here. And it worked against Norwich. And he didn't start tonight, presumably because of these injuries. He's not up to playing 3 matches in a week. But ultimately, having those more direct players is a good thing. I think for example, the likes of Poveda is a very direct footballer, and maybe he would have been a good idea to start tonight. Nonto and Anthony both play that overly clever little stuff, and it doesn't always work. Also, maybe we consider something that isn't just that direct transitional stuff. Maybe we consider taking a little bit more control. If they want to press us, we can tire them out, pass the ball around the back, keep it in midfield, maybe 3 straight-up midfielders in a traditional 4-3-3 or something like that, where we can make Stoke run themselves to death in the first half, and then we get direct. We can still create chances because we've got a lot of the ball. We've played cleverly and dealt with the press, but then again, that requires getting up to speed with the match, which is something that will need to be dealt with tactical changes and getting the likes of Gruev properly embedded in the system. But ultimately, what does all of this mean? It means that I think we need to adapt very, very quickly. If we do not adapt to the way that we are playing, other teams will, and will go even more goals behind in first halves, and we can't always pull a Norwich result out of the bag. That's not going to happen every single time, and the more we're on the back foot, the more trouble we're going to be in. Anyway, comment down below what you think is the solution to this problem, whether you think it's the problem at all, or whether you think one of the previously mentioned issues that I've just flashed up on screen here is the issue that we really need to deal with the most. Like the video as well, and subscribe if you haven't already. It's massively appreciated. You could also be a channel member if you really like, and I will see you later.